Chapter 20. Lal's Library, Houses of Parliament, Saturday the 2nd of June, 2463. Even death is not to be feared by one who has lived wisely. Buddha. "What the devil?" said Lal, when B ushered Andy, supported by Bill, into his library. He swung his feet off the couch, got up, and gestured an armchair for him. "Come, take a seat. What happened to you?" It was late morning, the room was hot, the windows were closed, and layers of soporific tobacco smoke hung in the still air. Andy declined, saying he'd prefer to sit on something firmer. While B opened the windows, Lal got him a hardback chair, placing a cushion on it. He winced as he lowered himself down. "You're hurt, my friend," he said. "How did this happen?" "Last night," prompted Bill. "Someone stabbed him on the dive." "Stabbed him?" said Lal, almost inaudibly. "But who?" Andy had mulled over whether to tell the authorities about what had happened, but had decided he wanted to speak to the doctor first, so he told him. Lal listened in silence. Finally he interrupted. "So they attacked you first?" It seemed important to him to establish who started it. "Yes, doctor." "By 4 of them, you say?" "Yes." "And you say they would have definitely drowned?" Andy nodded. Lal frowned and bit his bottom lip. "You didn't get a good look at their faces?" Andy raised a wry smile. "No, but that comes to my next point." Lal's mouth dropped. "Your next point? What's that?" "Remember I told you about that professor who was my diving buddy, the one who found the case the first time we went down?" "Yes, the young fellow." "Well, he's gone missing." "Missing?" His eyes darted from Andy to Bill to B, and back to Andy. "What do you mean, missing?" "After I got this stitched up at the clinic this morning, Bill went to the hostel to meet the profs. We had a cancel a dive planned on Paddington, can't go down like this. And they asked him if he'd seen Fayong." "If Bill had seen Fayong?" "Yeah. No one had seen him since they'd returned from their tour of London the previous afternoon." "Didn't he return with the others? Could he be lost in the woods or wandering about somewhere?" "No, he came back with the others. They missed him at dinner." Lal stroked his beard, searching for questions. "Had he any problems with the others, or such like?" Andy shook his head. "Not that I never noticed. Seemed popular, everyone liked him. They were genuinely concerned, stated he was in fine, good spirits." There followed a silence, before Lal broke it with a pregnant question. "Andy, do you think that this Fayong might have been one of the 4 who attacked you last night?" Andy breathed in deeply, weighing up the possibilities. He had asked himself the same question too, but shook his head. "Don't think so." "And why not?" "Too green. Not up to it. My instincts say no." "So have you told the police?" He was thinking of the ramifications that would follow from 1 missing professor and 4 dead intruders in the underground. "Not yet," replied Andy. "I wanted to sound you out first. Like they say, once is chance, twice coincidence. 3rd time is you'd better watch your back." "3rd time? What do you mean by that?" "Last night after the dive, I went to my apartment and found that it had been broken into." "What?" "Yes." Andy's voice was flat and matter-of-fact. "Ransacked." "Half ransacked," corrected Bill. Andy cast him a sullen look. "Half ransacked, then." Lal blinked and gave his head a shake. "What do you mean, half ransacked?" "They were disturbed." Andy shot B a guilty glance. I had a friend visiting. She's an old friend." Lal wondered why men always deceived themselves into believing they could keep their philandering a secret. He had known about Andy's extra woman, indeed women, for years. "She was returning from the Cock and Kitten Inn, the one. She works there as a barmaid." Lal nodded. London now boasted a couple of dozen drinking dens, plus 2 brothels, mainly in the Covent Garden area, to entertain its 2,300 workers and students. "And?" he pressed. "And she, with a friend, they found the door wide open." "And what happened then?" "She said she heard some footsteps, and then 2 men ran out. One punched her in the eye and she went down. Her friends screamed and they ran off into the night. Scum! And is she, your friend, is she all right? Well, all right in time. Black eye. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. He leaned forward and gave Andy's arm a sympathetic pat. Did you lose anything? Not much, maybe some papers, but the place was a mess. Strange, said Lyle. Did she get a look at these robbers? Well, her friend did. Said they looked Chinese. Lyle's face pinched into frown. Crimes like these were rare in London. There were, of course, regular drunken fights, occasional stabbings, and the prevalent threat from armed looters, but looters were a different category. They were after bigger fish. Plus Lyle had never heard of looters being Chinese. Apart from the visitors and perhaps no more than 50 or so students, there were no other Chinese in London. Could she identify them again? Perhaps. Describe them as large blokes. Lyle deliberated for some moments. Do you think, he said finally, you could ask your friend's friend to try and identify if these miscreants were some of your diving professors? About half, I believe, are Chinese. I'll ask her. He sounded reticent. Yes. Why not bring her along with you to the farewell banquet this evening? I would never suspect any other rough, tough types that you're describing. He paused, weighing up what he had just said. Still, he then saw Andy's look of hesitation. How clumsy of me. He chided himself. And if you want to invite your other friend, the one with the black eye, please do so too. He could imagine how Andy would try to explain to his bruised and battered mistress that he had to take her friend out to a banquet and leave her behind. Doctor, I'm thinking all this must have something to do with that case we found. I'm sure you're right, he replied bluntly. I'm sure it has everything to do with the case you found. Really? Why do you say that? Said B, who had been an onlooker until now. Well, like Andy said, too many coincidences. He looked thoughtful. And I feel, having risked your lives on this matter, that I owe you a full explanation of what I have so far deduced. He then went on to recount the conversations that James had recovered from his Apple snaz between Larry Brubaker and Sanjay Dutt. He told them of the indistinct piece of video showing Brubaker being possibly chased into Piccadilly Underground, all about the time the radiation missile hit London. So, you see, he concluded, we have something of a mystery here. Our Larry was a top dog in the immensely powerful Vivimus Corporation. He accuses its founder, Sanjay Dutt, of collaborating with a certain Marshall Lee to kill thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of his own people by implanting nanobots, or what we might call micro-machines, in their heads. And that's not all. These conversations lead us to believe that Sanjay Dutt, or a double of his, was in London the day it was destroyed. Yet we know that this Sanjay died some 4 years later. He ran his fingers through his hair. But equally, with the little time I've had to research it, there are no records of a Lawrence Brubaker ever having worked at Vivimus. Now for me that's puzzling, very puzzling. How can the records of someone so important have been erased so completely? We're talking here about the zenith of the information age. He must have left millions, if not billions, of footprints behind, yet it seems the only things we know about him are in that case. No one said anything as the doctor's words sank in. Finally, B said, By the way, I've heard nothing back from the Foundation from my telegram. That's no surprise. So, this is all about two blokes who fell out with each other 400 years ago, said Andy, pulling a sarcastic grin, who are both long dead. Lal couldn't hide his irritation, except that Sanjay Dutt was the most important figure in the 21st century, and his legacy still reverberates to this day. His great legacy is the Foundation, originally called the Vivimus Foundation. They fund, amongst other things, the WAC and therefore us, for instance. No, there's got to be more to it. Andy had not intended to sound so flippant. Okay, I can understand why you're interested, being historical and all that. But what I don't understand is why anybody else would give a damn. Why is Fayong missing? Why was my place broken into? And why would anyone take the risk of diving the underground without a proper guide and attack me? They were good points. Lal gazed up at the ceiling. Didn't one of the Chinese states send a whole team of divers down there some time ago? Yeah, said Andy, perking up. That was nearly 30 years ago. Gone into diving legend. 45 divers from the Han Navy went down. 45 divers from the Han Navy stayed down. All drowned, didn't they? Yeah, that's right. Sheer stupidity. You've got to remember it was a lot hairier in those days. They've recovered 33 bodies, which means a dozen are still down there. Which station? Andy looked pensive for a moment. Leicester Square, I think. Well, that's it. Nearest station to Piccadilly. My hunch is correct. They must have suspected there was something under London worth dying for. Bill then spoke up. Andy, show the doctor what we took off those guys last night. He placed the yellow bag onto the table. Andy reached inside. What do you make of this? He pulled out a brown skull, holding it high for the others to see. Pretty, don't you think? Some strands of grey, translucent muscle were still battened onto it. The few wisps of hair clinging onto what remained of the scalp had dried and frizzled out, so that it looked like some demonic madman. Lal grimaced. It's the freezing water, said Andy. Slows the decay. Here, take a look. He passed it to him. Lal held it at arm's length as he looked into its hollow eye sockets. Alas, poor Larry might be appropriate. Lifting it up to the sunlight, he rolled it over. A trickle of water dribbled out onto his cheek, and he took a silk handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed himself. After a minute or so, he asked, Can someone please pass me a torch? Should be one on that bookcase there. B? She brought it over to him. He shone it through the aperture where the skull would attach to the spine. Strange, he muttered, after some moments of prodding. Very strange. Andy, did you notice this? He leaned over, handing the skull and torch to him. Look at the base of the skull. There's a growth of bone over what looks like a black patch. See it? Easily missable. That's not natural. Andy studied it and agreed. Now, look into the cranium. The inside seems coated with some type of black resin, doesn't it? Yeah, I see it, said Andy, holding it up and squinting. What do you think it is? Not sure. Perhaps it was some advanced type of medical treatment. I wonder if they made the insertion at the base of the skull and somehow spread it over the inner cranium. Andy handed the skull to Bill. B said, Perhaps it's one of those, what did you call it? A micro-machine. Nanobot. Don't know, I've never seen one. I'd have to ask James. Why don't we do a DNA profile on it, she suggested. I've got a couple of units in my cupboard. Should only take 5 minutes or so. She left and returned some moments later with one. I've analysed thousands of these things in my time. Leave it to me. This was her turn to contribute. We'll soon know to whom our mystery skull belongs. She switched on the device, and a high-pitched whining sounded. Holding it over the cranium, the tone changed as the drill engaged with bone. Amazing little thing, and still works perfectly after all this time. After 10 or so seconds, she stopped. And now, she said, it's analysing the DNA sample taken from the bone and referring the results to the database of 7 or so million victims. Then it'll give us the name and face of the person. She smiled. Takes about 5 minutes. Everyone watched her in silence. To break the tension, she talked about the fun of those early days, when a dozen years ago she was part of the original team of 45. She described how they camped out in the open or bivouacked inside buildings, usually at a different spot every few days. As they could only eat what they carried, they would often lay out snares and shoot game, so that most evenings they would be wood pigeon or partridge, hot off the gun to roast, plus the occasional rabbit and sometimes venison. The doctor, she told Andy and Bill, had given her the responsibility for cataloguing and a team of 6 men. This meant that she and her team would enter buildings, taking an inventory of their contents, photographing them and DNAing intact skeletons. It was a most unusual appointment. Rare was it for a woman, rarer for a young woman to command men, particularly qualified and educated men. Lal noticed that both Andy and Bill seemed nonplussed when she said this, But no one was particularly listening, as everyone had heard versions of the same story before, and she was relieved when the device finally bleeped. "Done," she announced, her eyes glinting. "Let's see what it reads, shall we?" No one had said it, but everyone was half expecting the profile would turn out to be Larry Brubaker. That would go some way to completing the circle. She frowned, and her face fell. "What does it say?" urged Lal. She continued staring at the machine. "B, what does it say?" She turned to him and shook her head. "NRF. No results found." "Nothing? But I thought you said these machines are 99% accurate." She could only shrug. "They usually are. The problem is that the machine should at least tell us the unique DNA code of this fellow, his sex, racial group, etc., etc. So what's it saying for the DNA code?" "Just blocked." She handed it to him to see for himself. He read it and shook his head. Could this machine be wrong? Machines can always make mistakes, especially these damn antiques. Possibly. I've had plenty of NRFs, but never one not delivering a unique DNA code. Lal's voice arose in exasperation. How the hell did someone, a long time ago, somehow block this particular man's unique code? Why would anyone want to do that? Someone, please tell me. Andy spoke up. "But what I don't understand is how did these guys choose this particular skull out of all the skulls in the train? How did they know this one was lined on the inside with all that black stuff? Did they have some sort of special tracker?" Lal, reeling from the questions, had no answers. "I'm as flummoxed as you are," he confessed, knowing it sounded weak. Andy glanced at his cousin. "So, Doctor, what are we going to do? Are we going to tell the authorities or keep quiet about this or what?" He deliberately served the ball into Lal's side of the court. The attack ought to be reported to the police at Windsor. 4 divers had been drowned. No one had yet reported them as missing, and it was unlikely that anyone would do so. Everyone in the room knew that neither Andy nor Bill would face any problems from the police. As a part-time captain of the guards, Andy had the authority to apprehend, disarm, and, if necessary, kill looters. The doctor shifted uneasily and tugged at the skin on his neck. He knew that it was the correct thing to do, particularly as Fayong had gone missing and his disappearance could be connected. But this was not a good time for an embarrassment to fall into his lap. The delegation was due to depart tomorrow. It was B who rescued him. "Andy, I suggest we don't tell the police, at least not for the moment. Telling them might only alert whoever is looking for this thing." She gestured at the skull. "In any case, they wouldn't be bothered to take a day out to come or here all the way from Windsor. We need to continue looking for Fayong, of course. He could have wandered off and tripped over some masonry and be lying out there with a broken leg or something. We need to send out search parties. We all know that London can be a dangerous place to get lost in." Andy nodded. The city had to be treated with respect. There were a handful of grisly tales about unseasoned archaeologists getting themselves lost. One had probably injured himself and then been eaten alive by one of the packs of feral dogs which hunted in its environs. He would order a troop of guards to search for him, but had a hunch that the young man would not be seen alive again. "Well, that seems a reasonable plan," said the doctor. He wanted to get to the bottom of this conundrum quickly. He wanted to resolve it before he was obliged to leave London, and with the speed things were happening, that could be a lot sooner than by the end of the year. Was this, he questioned, just a hairline fracture in history, or was it a major fault line? He needed to know.